So welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to host you in this new building, right? I don't think it's the first talk. I think you managed to beat the record because there was a talk like last week or 2 weeks ago, right? Yeah. But maybe it's the second talk. Okay. So the longer waiting building. So it's an honor to be associated with this event for the College of Linguistics, and thanks to the CEFC, the French Research Center on Contemporary China. But as the name doesn't take, we have a lot of people working specifically on Taiwan in this research center. And I don't know if all of you can say one word about our center.
Yeah. Well, yes.法国现代中国研究中心 which is in Taiwan. So it's 中国，但是其实香港、台湾，我们来是研究台湾电影，所以就这样子。然后我们就是欢迎各样各种的法国还是法文 speaking or international researcher 来研究台湾现代文化，就是1949年之后，包括语言、社会、历史、电影、文学等等。对，所以就是我们很荣幸就跟已经1年跟合作，然后非常欢迎我的只是同胞，也是意大利人，对，所以就 very international and thank you for being here and if you're interested to check CEFC, we are in 中央研究院，然后这方面很多就现在台湾的研究，包括很多关于电影的，对，所以我真的很希望以后。再会有机会跟你们合作聊天，会 feedback 这样子。好，谢谢。Oh, are we connected?
Yeah.
Connect me.
Yeah.
Can I show my face?
Yeah, you can. The lab, you mean?
Yeah. No. Holidays. No.
CEFC.
Yes. Yeah, no.
CEFC. CEFC.
Just a second.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
So that's like really like this, what the name doesn't say, is like really like open for anyone in humanities and extended that's looking for collaboration with friends. So you're welcome to get in touch and yeah. So today we will together we have the TIDA and NTU and the CFC have the opportunity to invite Emmanuele Chersoni from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, Chinese bilingual studies. And Hong Kong, well, Emmanuele was doing for quite a while now, right? Because he did a PhD in between France and Italy, Aix-en-Provence and Pisa, and he was actually in the lab where I was back then. So it's a great opportunity to see him here. And originally, I would say his research is really like foundational, computational linguistics with foundational issues, trying to bring together cognitive, theoretical aspects thanks to a computational framework. So focusing mostly on the, let's say, distributional model of meaning. So that was, in our field, maybe antiquity, given that a new thing happened every other week. But it's really the kind of topic that really at the core, at the basement of what is the modern contemporary natural language processing and large language model, which is basically building representation, building knowledge from data, from text, and that's really is core training. And then through the year, you got many very strong papers in these theoretical and foundational topics. But then I guess through the year, you see how to apply these foundational issues, these foundational models to a wide range of topics, going from finance, healthcare, and even I saw some papers I didn't know before about the cuisines.
Yes.
So maybe and maybe recently, and what we talk a bit about today, perhaps related to creative industries as well. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Emmanuele, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lorano, Corrado, and Shukai for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here. I had prepared a slide of some presentation, but I think Lorano already said everything. So the idea of exploring LLMs for arts and humanities is actually a very recent interest for me, and I was planning to use this talk to do some brainstorming, so I'm very happy to discuss this evolving ideas with you. This is the general structure that I was thinking to give to my talk. So at the beginning, I will talk about the rise of the large language models that happened in the last few years. Then I want to discuss the issue of LLMs in arts, which boils down to one main issue, which is can the machines be really creative? Then I will present a case study in digital humanities, that is the usage of LLMs for video game localization. And for the video game, we choose the recent Black Myth Wukong that was recently released for PlayStation 5 and PC. So I hope that there are some gamers in this room, because I'm a big gamer. I love video games. And this game was a nice excuse for me to mix my work and my hobby. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. So LLMs, probably the story of modern LLMs started in November 2022 with the release of ChatGPT that made waves all around the world. It was the most powerful chatbot ever created, and we have seen the value of this company, OpenAI, jumping to almost 30 billion of US dollars, and probably now it's more than 10 times more valuable than that. And we have seen also the recent part of the story with a small Chinese startup, DeepSeek, that is now competing against the American giants, despite having much less computing power available. So this could be the beginning also of a new phase where we have smaller companies with much less GPU power that make open source models that can compete against the closed source models from OpenAI, from Google, and other big actors. Computational power, however, is still likely to be a big factor in the near future. Not everyone can train an LLM, so we generally rely on large models that have been trained by somebody else. This is just a figure to give you an idea of how the parameter size of these machines grew over the years between 2018 and 2023, and now the most powerful version of the GPT-4 and the DeepSeek are even bigger than that. LLMs are generally based on the transformer architecture, and they're trained on vast amount of data on the task of next word prediction, what we call the pre-training of the model. This is illustrated by this figure. The model is exposed to millions of sentences in which it has to see the prefix, the input of a sentence, and predict the word that is coming next. This is what we call a language model. And then the adjective large primarily refers to their parameter size. Why do we care about the models being large? Because it has been theorized that the growth of the parameter size coincides with the emergence of some particular skills, some particular knowledge in these models. More specifically, there was this paper in 2022 showing that the capacity that the LLMs have of interacting naturally with a user via prompts arises with the size. There is this sort of magic number, I would say, around 6.7 billion of parameters. Models beyond that size display a particular behavior. They display in their hidden states some features that achieve anomalously high values. And the emergence of these high values in the internal dimensions of the transformer coincides with the the behavior that we call in-context learning in LLMs, the capacity that they have to learn a task just by interacting with the user. Notice that this task, which may seem trivial to humans, requires some specific linguistic knowledge, at least some knowledge of the syntax of English. For example, if you read this prefix, the cat sat on the, you know that probably the word coming next is going to be a noun. And you also need some knowledge of semantics. You may know some about typical things that cats can be sitting on. And you have to rely on this knowledge to make a prediction. And the same goes for the machines. Surprisingly, systems that train on vast amount of text acquire a consistent amount of linguistic knowledge. It has been an open debate whether it is a real knowledge of language or it is just parroting. There was a very famous paper in 2021 by Emily Bender and colleagues called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. The basic claim was that the LLMs do not learn real knowledge about language, they just rely on statistical associations between words, but they're not able, for example, to make connections between the words and the entities the words refer to in the real world. I have to say that in my personal research, I've got a few results that are backing this claim. We developed several methodologies for analyzing the knowledge of the models of grammaticality, of semantic plausibility, by comparing the performance of the model with prompting and the performance of the model by analyzing the internal representation, the probability values. And our general finding in all cases is that the model internal probabilities are an upper bound for model performance. In other words, a model is trained on a corpus, it learns some probabilities from that corpus, and it cannot go beyond that knowledge. If you compare the performance of what you get from a model by prompting and what you can get by log probability, with models up to 10 billion parameters, generally the log probabilities are much higher, much better. The closer you get to 10 billion parameters, the gap is narrowing down. I'm a bit agnostic about the most recently introduced models, for example, DeepSeek with the reinforcement learning, the so-called large reasoning models, because they are very recent introductions in the literature, so we didn't manage to run a test on these. But for the models, let's say up to the 7 billion threshold, this finding holds. It is more like statistical associations between words. But regardless of whether the knowledge of the model is true linguistic knowledge or not, the reason why the language models since ChatGPT stimulated the interest of so many users is their striking naturalness in conversation. You can just start chatting with a model, talking about random things, and you have the impression of a conversation with a real person. Also, when you need the model to carry out some task, there is no need of a specific training because the model can learn the task simply in context via prompting during a natural interaction with the user. So this led to a very spontaneous question. To what extent the models can generate novel concepts and ideas beyond what they have seen during their training? That is the question of machine creativity. Notice that this is not just a purely speculative or philosophical question, because this has a massive impact on the job market. There are many jobs that are connected to human creativity, like visual arts, design, journalism, communication. So many people are asking the question, are the machines going to replace us or not? So here we come to the second part and the issue of creativity. How do we frame the question of creativity with regards to machines? Most scholars make reference to the work of this philosopher, Margaret Boden, working in the UK. In the early 2000s, she wrote several papers about machine creativity and whether AI can achieve human-level creativity. This is the definition that she gave. Creativity is the ability to come up with ideas or artifacts that are new, surprising, and valuable. Concerning the last attribute, the value, I believe that there is a little doubt nowadays about the value of LLM artifacts in terms of output quality and societal acceptance. But how about new and surprising? Well, if you show to a random person the outputs of a language model, it may still sound as new and surprising. But still, this novelty and this surprise is a product of a probabilistic process. The model has been trained on textual data, and it will produce some data that is generated from the very same probabilities. So it is not technically something totally new, something totally surprising. Margaret Boden also provides some other categorization about the types of creativity and the perception of creativity. For the types of creativity, probably the first type is the most relevant for the ongoing discussion. She defines combinatorial creativity, a type of creativity consisting of combining familiar elements to create something unfamiliar. Then you have exploratory creativity, which is achieved by finding innovative solutions within the current space of thinking. And finally, transformational creativity involving a change in the current style of thinking. And this is the category into which she puts the most famous works of art of Western tradition. Scholars, they generally tend to classify the current state of machine creativity as combinatorial, and they are of the opinion that with the current state of technology, combinatorial creativity is the most that we can achieve. About the perspectives on creativity, Boden also makes a distinction between P creativity and H creativity. P creativity involves coming up with a surprising, valuable idea that is new to the person who comes up with it. So it's a personal level creativity. And my addition, something that is surprising and valuable to a specific public, not just to the creator. And then we have H creativity, standing for historical creativity. And this relates to ideas that no one has ever had before in history. This, I believe, is an important distinction because when creating products for consumption, probably the first type of creativity is everything that we need. Many of the products that we consume in the entertainment industry, for example, they are derivative. They're not totally new, but they have been created in order to be still surprising, still enjoyable enough for a specific public. And how can we use LLMs for creating literature? How do they perform when they have to do something creative themselves? Well, first of all, LLMs, they're frequently used as writing assistants, not as primary writers. There are various tools based on generative AI, such as Story Center, Warcraft, that you can use for collaborative writing. So you have a writer, you have an artist trying to write, to throw down ideas for a given plot. And then it has this collaboration with the AI. AI can give a suggestion on how to improve the style, how to improve the creation of the characters, so on different aspects of the story. And in this way, the story is a co-creation between human and AI. There are some studies about the effects of this co-creation. There is a recent one that came out this year, showing that the generalized use of LLMs as assistant leads to the uniformation of writing style and the reduction of linguistic diversity. They ran a general psycholinguistic study with the participants from many different backgrounds, different genders, different ages, social extraction, and political ideas. And at the beginning, they observed that these people, they have some linguistic features, some lexical choices that are strongly related to their personal demographics. But then after that, these people use the same LLM assistant, this linguistic diversity gets reduced. They tend to write in more or less in the same way. And how about LLMs when they have to write something totally by themselves? So not the setting of co-creation, LLMs as primary writers. There have been several studies on LLMs writing short stories, and all of them reported different outcomes depending on the evaluation method. I try to summarize these studies. I think a main finding that is common to most authors is that when you compare LLMs to average human writers, they're not distinguishable. Humans, they rate the stories from average human writers and the stories by LLM more or less in the same way. But still, they tend to fall short of professional human writers, especially in terms of perceived creativity and originality of the output. If we move to the domain of architecture, design, and visual arts, we can see that LLMs are mostly used as a design assistant. What happens is you feed a prompt to a language model. The language model produces a prompt to software such as Midjourney or Stable Diffusion to generate an image. And in this way, it can generate sketches, architectural floor plans with specific styles. And then the designer, the artist, is left with the task of refining the output. So also in this case, we can see the element of the co-creation that we mentioned before. And you can see that LLM tools have great potential to support the creatives. This really cuts the time of developing a project, but it still may lead to style uniformity. And we can see that it is very likely that in the future, LLMs will be able to generate some of this design variation on their own. This is an example of a museum design generated using the Midjourney software enhanced with Stable Diffusion. And here you have a real expert of AI architecture and design. So if you're more interested in this aspect, you can ask her more questions later. So going back to the categories that we discussed before, we may ask, is creativity other than combinatorial? Is historical creativity really needed from LLMs after all? Neil Leach, who is one of the gurus in the discussion about LLMs and arts, particularly LLMs and architecture, states that forms of art, such as architecture, rely on a vocabulary of canonical expressions. And many projects can just be realized via variations of the same underlying design. Generative AI can just provide massive libraries of design choices for designers that simply have to prompt the model to generate a first draft. So you can see that an AI-based design is possible simply on the basis of combinatorial creativity. When we come to writing, I would say that as long as plots of novels, films, video games can be written in terms of a variation of conventionalized tropes, LLMs will soon be undistinguishable from humans, exactly because many entertainment products are often very conventional. Plots of multiple novels and movies that can be studied in terms of common patterns. And I think LLMs are going to meet this kind of demand very soon. So what is the space of human creatives in this revolution? Well, it's not the first time that the human creative activity becomes reproducible by a new technology. I think, for example, about the evolution of figurative painting at the beginning of the 20th century, after the invention of modern photography. We can see that a lot of art, a lot of avant-garde, they moved away from what the technology was able to reproduce. And I believe that art can still find new ways to differentiate itself for what the machines can do. But on the other hand, I also believe that forms of art that are easier to reproduce by AI, for example, short stories, for example, short forms of poems like the haiku, they're likely to become more rare because they're too easy for a model to reproduce to a level that is not distinguishable from human creation. And one of the main consequences for us, since the target of this talk is the Faculty of the Humanities, writers, creatives, but humanities professionals will need the technical skills in generative artificial intelligence. This will deeply affect how we conceive humanities studies. One thing that I experienced in my still brief academic career is that many university departments and courses are organized around all disciplines groupings. However, the digital world we live in is evolving very quickly, and an introduction to generative AI tools is more than ever required. We need courses in digital humanities, and we need that these courses provide practical education with AI tools so that we make the students aware of the new standards and of the new opportunities for future job careers. And this is the slide that concludes the first part of the talk, and I think this would be a good moment to stop. We wanted to have a first discussion on this part. If you have any questions or any curiosity.
I have a remarks for you.
Yeah.
About the Margaret Borden 3 types of critical activity. It seems the last one is acceptable, but the ceremony is available. We think
New, surprising, valuable.
We think that production is the word, not just surprising, new, and valuable, but not just acceptable. It's not the same thing. That is the first thing. The second thing is that human creation, human production is often considered going through kind of unconscious process, while in machine part or AI part, it seems not determinable or decidable. There's a conscious process. I would like to know your opinion about that.
Yeah, for the last part, it's not a deterministic process. It's not something that we can explain because these models are big black boxes. It's really difficult to interpret where the output is coming from. So yeah, in this sense, you're absolutely right. But the first part, so you say it doesn't matter.
In the version I've read about Margaret Borden, it seems to be just acceptable production, but
valuable.
Considered as valuable. So that is a creation. Not every production we consider as creative. They are not considered as valuable. It is just acceptable.
Yeah, you're right.
The sentence is acceptable grammatically, but would not be considered as creative. But considered as valuable in the sense of creation or writing or.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, this might have been a conceptual jump that I made by myself.
Yeah, maybe acceptable is just a bit weak. Definition of creative.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have more technical question, but since we're more on the general, more like philosophical, I have also a question at this level. Creativity. I mean, I think there's something I miss a little bit. Is it's a lot about in a context in a community. So if you take again the example of the painting of your art, when Klein did this blue painting, it's just a blue square. It was probably supposed to be creative, but if nowadays a model mid-journey give you a blue screen, it will not be creative, you know. So I think a lot of the the idea of when we attribute the property creativity intuitively to something, it's within a community, within a context. So in a sense, the production, even a basic stupid generation, could be creative if when the user is obtaining this basic story, he didn't expect that, but at the same time has a positive impression, and they say, okay, somehow it's not what I expected, but is actually answering or is actually surprising me and doing something that I didn't expect. And in a sense, I guess the LLMs are very far from it because it's probably related to two other parts of the creativity. But I think it's really grounded with the idea of context, community, situation thing, right?
Yeah, I guess so. And it is also, I would say, it's probably also connected with the notion of intentionality to some extent. Because that was a fair remark that there is a component, unconscious component in artistic creation, but there is also a conscious component, and this is something that probably the LLMs are still lacking at the moment. They don't have any, well, for what we know. There was 1 month ago a paper by Fudan University claiming that they found an AI that was able to self-replicate by itself. So here we are talking about Skynet, Terminator sort of scenarios. But yeah, for what we know at the moment, there is also this component has not been reached by LLMs.
Follow up Laurent's question about the creativity. I mean, if the human creativity is defined by something like, okay, never happened or seen in human history. So let's suppose one day the AI suppress humans' intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we know we understand the machine creativity in its turn? You know what I mean? There's a paradox, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the creativity that we are talking about. This is human creativity, right? And we assume that machines still, in one way or another, still have less creativity than human at this stage. In the coming days, say, I don't know.
Yeah.
So how we handle this, how we think about the creativity in that scenario.
Yeah. Very tough question, I would say. Yeah, in general, I think that all of the work done on interpreting language models, the so-called interpretability, is basically trying to apply human concept, explain in terms of human symbolic language, the behavior of something that probably cannot be explained. And we use the metaphor of how the brain works, but in the end, we're not even totally sure that the brain works in this way. I mean, if you have a doctor taking a decision about a patient, probably what drives his decision is not just what you could describe in terms of textbook practice of the doctor. It's the sum of all the years of experience, data that he has seen, plus the textbook thing that the doctor studied. And this is something that you cannot express in human language. I think for the creativity would be a similar kind of thing. Yeah, we're still evaluating it as using a human criteria.
Well, if I may jump in, I think it's a good question, definitely. And if I may jump in to follow up on the discussion, I think the argument is never to compare the machine's creativity with the human's creativity, because the machine will be giving us surprises. But I think it is up to us to judge whether or not we can define it as creativity. As someone who is using AI in their practice and also teaching others to use AI in their design practices, I believe that it is quite clear to the industry that the machine can only help to enhance the creativity of one. I often get very surprising results when using AI to design. And would I think that the result is creditable to the machine? I wouldn't. And I would always think that it is a collaborative relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that the perspective that I presented a few slides ago, what I called the co-creation between human and LLMs, so far is the predominant perspective in studies on LLM and creativity. Not just for artistic creation, there is the idea that for many complex tasks that require planning, in which you need to use a machine as an extension of experienced user, a domain knowledge expert. The level of complexity goes beyond what the machine can be trained on. So what you have is a complex scenario of a collaboration between the human and machine, where the human can give continuously feedback to the machine and personalize more and more the outputs. So if I have to put my money on the perspective that is going to win, I think this co-creation is the best candidate. I think there are also many novels now that have been written in collaboration between humans and machines. I think in the Western culture there is still a lot of resistance towards that, because in Europe, for example, where the regulation of AI has been much stricter than in other parts of the world, the idea is that writing with AI is just plagiarism. But I've heard that in the Chinese context, for example, there have been novels that have been co-written by an author and an AI.
Yeah, because you're talking about literature, and as a paleontological person myself, it was really interesting to see this Lord of the Rings. The first question, what is that?
It was a plot of a character interaction in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, internal directed graph.
Okay, that's not I read. Which means?
So what I started from a trend of literary studies that I heard of a few years ago. Do you know Franco Moretti?
Yes, yeah, and that was also my second question.
Okay.
Of course, how do you read it? Because coming back from the Pleistocene, it's something that people in literature has been doing, to read from a distance, so have a bunch of quantitative materials and recognize that somehow the most genius, and a lot of brackets because I'm not sure what genius is, from Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle, that Moretti was studying, to other things, come up in certain, and back to Laurent, time and places where also readership is ready to accept, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, a scientific approach to crime. And that's why he made the success that we know, but he demonstrated by reading tons, or letting his PhD students reading.
Exactly.
So, well, now it's AI probably doing this. But again, so something, it just, I don't know, feels like AI is another actor doing what, yes, human beings has been doing. So this is not original. Lord of the Rings is not. It is following many patterns and many legend, religious tropes and things that humankind has been doing since ages. But then he managed to find this particular crux in time where readership was ready.
My point is mentioning this was that I think the perspective of Moretti stresses the fact that instead of focusing on single works, we should focus on the general patterns, the literary production of a given historical period. And you can see some outliers, and maybe these outliers will be those studied in the future in history of literature, we don't know, but you see also a lot of literary production that falls within a trend that can be easily summarized by algorithms. So the idea is that as long as the trend is consolidated, is easy to learn it from data, and it is easy for the machine to reproduce that. I expect that in the future, instead of having many Netflix series pretty much with the same kind of plots, same kind of tropes, we will just have a machine being trained on this movie production and just generate some variations, and that's with it. Any other question, or you want to move to the next part? Okay, I guess we can move to the next part. So the last part is I wanted to show to you a case study in digital humanities that we are currently working on in my lab. And yeah, this is the geeky part of the talk. So if there are gamers here, feel free to go wild. So I think there is a special relevance for LLMs in the field of digital humanities. I was a student of digital humanities myself around 15 years ago when I studied this discipline at the University of Pisa. The bachelor degree at the University of Pisa had this nice motto: the things to say, the tools to say them. So the things to say encompasses the traditional values of the humanities. All this amount of knowledge that the humanities discipline try to transmit to the next generation. And the tools to say them for us living in the digital age is the digital part in the name of the discipline. This study course was mixing traditional humanities, so literature, arts, philosophy, etc., and digital technologies. So you also could get training in programming, machine learning, and so on. In general, I think there is not a unique definition of digital humanities. They're, generally speaking, a set of disciplines at the intersection between these two words. And there is a special interest also in investigating how the digital medium affects the message, how the digital world modifies this part of the culture that we choose to convey. LLMs will be used, in my view, more and more as media to communicate cultural contents. And in this sense, we can see them as the main tool of digital humanities in the future. So this is why I chose this case study, because I think it's highly relevant for humanities and cultural communication. The case of a Chinese video game localization. Just to give you some figure, according to estimates of 2024, there are more than 3 billion active gamers in the world, so a very large population. I must say, unfortunately, there are likely to be more than the avid readers of books. I'm sure that in Italy, for example, there are more video gamers than book readers. I don't know about other countries, but this is the sad reality. So this game is the recent success story of the Chinese video game industry. It's a game that was published in 2024 by a team called Game Science, and it is considered as the first AAA game from the Chinese industry. And it is available for both PC and the PlayStation 5. It is inspired by the classical novel Journey to the West, and in the game, the player controls the destined one, a monkey protagonist based on Sun Wukong. It is full of references not just to Chinese literature, but also to several elements of Chinese popular culture. And indeed, after the game released, it sold more than 20 million copies, so a big success. But there was also a surge in book sales and a surge in popularity of related content. For example, there are many Western YouTubers that make videos in which they explain the different references to the novel, and all of a sudden, the people jump to these YouTube videos because they wanted to check all the details of the story. Oh, by the way, I haven't had the time to play the game yet. I bought it, but haven't had the time. As far as I know, is a sequel of the novel. So it starts after the Journey to the West ends. Video game industry, in my view, is a very promising field for large language models, because all the most powerful models nowadays are multilingual and they can be used for machine translation. You have to think that these games, they take several years of development and they have a very, very high production cost. And when they finish the development cycle, there needs to be a simultaneous localization in multiple languages for worldwide release. Recently, there have been many projects trying to incentivize Chinese developers. Probably the most famous one is China's Hero Project by Sony, which is encouraging Chinese developers via massive funding to make new games for the main gaming platforms. So it is very likely that in the future there will be more and more Chinese games that will need to be localized for Western audiences. And you can understand that this is a non-trivial challenge, because when you have to localize a game from the American Western culture, well, we grow up in a Western entertainment industry. We have all watched Hollywood movies, but Chinese culture, the Western audiences are much less familiar with it. So there are a lot of references that will get lost in the translation process. In this study, we also wanted to focus on how the offensive language is rendered by LLMs, because there is nothing more cultural specific than the way you offend someone. So I apologize in advance because this talk is not politically correct. So we wanted to check how do large language models perform in Chinese to English video game translation. So we had the first assessment of linguistic quality that we performed via traditional metrics in machine translation, such as bleu, rouge, bird score, etc. We used these automatic metrics to select the model that was performing better in translation. And then we used this model to compare it with the translation that were realized by the professional translators that have localized the game. Then a second scenario in which we wanted to analyze this comparison is sociocultural adequacy. In particular, how well do LLMs in translating cultural references, and how well they render offensive language. So this is the paper that we are currently writing with the colleagues at the Polytechnic University, and hopefully will be coming out soon. So in the game, we have 12 different languages being supported at the level of the subtitles, but the voice dialogues are available only in Chinese and English. So what my students did is to transcribe the subtitles from the official cutscenes and from publicly available walkthrough videos on YouTube. In this way, we built a parallel Chinese-English corpus of more than 2,000 sentence pairs. And we also annotated for each sentence which character is speaking and what is the text genre. It can be dialogue, can be lyrics, etc. And then we ran a first translation study from Chinese to English using these 4 models that are highly proficient in both Chinese and English. Q1Q by Alibaba, the Chinese version of Llama 3 from Meta, PowerBase, which I think is from a French research group, and finally the famous DeepSeek. And we used all the versions of the model of around 8 billion parameters for issues of GPU availability, but also because we wanted to see how the models perform when you keep all of them more or less the same parameter size. So we used different sets of instructions to test the models and to elicit the translation. We have several sets of prompts that simply ask to translate around 100 sentences from 16 different conversational turns. Then we have a prompt that is focusing on a specific character of the game, because we wanted to see to what extent the model is able to understand the personality of the character, the style of speaking of this character. And finally, we have a specific prompt for assessing the lyrics, because the lyrics make use of a more poetic language, so they're more challenging for the model to translate. These are the evaluation metrics that we used for our preliminary study. A first set of metric is based on n-gram overlap. So what you do is to take the gold standard of the human translation, you take the translation from the model, and you simply look at the overlap between the word choices. Then you have metrics based on semantic similarity. And if you're familiar with word embeddings and encoder models, what you do is to feed, again, the human translation and the large language model translation to a model like BERT. BERT will represent the meaning of this sentence in terms of a sentence embedding, a high-dimensional vector representation, and then it will compute the semantic similarity between the two. Why are these metrics important? Because sometimes the model might translate by using different words from those that humans would use, but maybe the concept, the meaning of the sentences could still be the same. So these metrics would be able to spot this meaning similarity beyond the differences in the surface word choices. And then you have some metrics that are a mix between these two criteria. So what we did is to compare all our models by using these metrics, and we picked the best to be compared with the human professional translators. In our test for the comparison human versus LLMs, we just fed human raters with the translations from humans or from LLMs, but we didn't tell them which one is which. So they just had to give ratings to the translation according to different criteria, but they don't know if the translation is coming from a human or from a machine. We used two different tasks. The first task is a task of translation quality. The translation was evaluated within the multidimensional quality metrics framework. It is a standard framework for the categorization of errors in machine translation and suggesting some criteria for evaluating the quality of a translation. For this specific study, we focus on three main criteria. The first one is accuracy. How accurate is the concept of a translated sentence? Fluency, how fluent the sentence sounds. And finally, cultural appropriateness, how appropriate is the translation of the cultural reference. And for each of these dimensions, we collected ratings on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, where 1 means not good and 5 means very good, from humans. So the humans have to rate each one of these three dimensions for each sentence that they are analyzing. And this is the second task. The second task is the detection of offensive language mitigation. First, we had two expert annotators, two students who are co-authors of the paper, who analyzed the corpus and selected 450 offensive expressions. And then for each one of these expressions, our recruited annotators have to perform a three-category classification task. They have to compare the translation with the Chinese original, and they have to say whether the translated version is more offensive, less offensive, or the less, more or less the less than the original. So the annotation was performed by bachelor students of the Department of Chinese and Bilingual Studies, specifically specializing in translation. Their native language is Mandarin Chinese. Almost all of them come from, I think all of them come from mainland China. And C1 is their minimum proficiency level in English. So before starting this annotation work, they were instructed on the MQN framework, and they were instructed on the game narrative well, some of them, because the other ones have already played the game, so this was not needed. And the results, they showed a fair level of agreement for the translation task, but a higher level of agreement for the rating of offensiveness. So this is the result that we got for the LLM study. This is just a technical comparison, so you don't need to pay attention to the details. But what we can observe basically is that the metrics measuring the word, the lexical overlap, have very low values. So the models, they generally choose different words from humans when they have to translate a sentence. But the values for the metrics based on semantics are much higher. So suggesting that even if the models may choose different words, they still manage to capture the meaning of the sentences correctly. And across the different prompt scenarios and the metrics, we observed that Q1Q by Alibaba was the best performing model. So we selected this model for the comparison with humans. So for accuracy and fluency, we notice that the ratings for the automatic translations by Q1Q were not significantly different from the original human translation. So if you give humans the translation and you make them rate accuracy and fluency, they cannot distinguish between a human quality translation, and these are professional translators because this is the original translation of the localized game. They cannot distinguish between professional translator and the video game translation by the large language model. Only 2 annotators out of 10 rated them to be rated the LLMs to be worse than humans. However, for the dimension of cultural appropriateness, 6 annotators out of 10 found LLMs to be significantly worse than the original translation, and much worse. It was a strongly significant effect. And then the annotators also had the chance of indicating what the problem was for each translation in their opinion, and most of them, they complained towards a tendency to trivialize the content. There was a feeling of lack of cultural authenticity in the translation. So this is the result for the second task. On the other hand, it can be immediately noticed that LLMs are more literal in preserving the original satirical or offensive meanings. You can see that with the LLMs, almost in the 70% of the cases, the annotators feel that the degree of offensiveness is the same of the original text. When it comes to humans, you can see that almost in 50% of the cases, the human translator choose to translate the text in order to it to be less offensive. They had the tendency to tone down offensive expressions, especially those addressing women and religion, probably because there is a goal of political correctness to present the game to Western audiences. So here you have an example that we took from the corpus. I'm not a Chinese speaker, so I'm sure that you can verify it much better than I could do myself. But you can see, for example, in the first case, you can see that the version translated by the humans, they really toned down the expression by saying misplaced their worship, while the translation of the LLM is much more direct and has almost a satirical tone, I would say. When it comes to ratings of cultural appropriateness, also there are some other issues that the annotators have noticed to be, in which the annotators noticed the LLMs to be systematically off, and those were the referential expressions in Chinese that rely on kinship terms, and also the lack of adaptation of culture-specific terminology. So in the first case, so in my understanding is that this character who is speaking now is a very arrogant and cocky character. He's very powerful and he knows to be powerful. And he tends to refer to himself as with the kinship term for the maternal uncle. But the model doesn't have this knowledge, and it thinks that the text is actually referring to the maternal uncle, the literal maternal uncle. So there are these things that are systematically wrong in the automatic translation all over the corpus. And other things that are typically wrong are issues related to cultural specific terminology. So in this context, the model goes very literal and translate the reference to the Lingshan. I think it is a mountain in Jiangsu province in the mainland that is very relevant for Buddhist culture, but as you can see from this translation, a Western audience would miss the religious component. Of course, with the professional translation linking it to Buddhahood, this component is correctly conveyed. And of course, the models lack this kind of knowledge for the translation. So to summarize, we have tried to see by using LLMs as tools of cultural translation in video games, what works and what does not work. Even if we use the models that are relatively small for nowadays size, 7 billion parameters is not that much, there is an accurate rendering of meaning and discourse flow. I repeat that the ratings for accuracy and fluency were not significantly different between professional translators and LLMs. There are, of course, problems with the component of cultural bridging, because LLMs often lack the relevant cultural context for producing the appropriate translation. You might have heard about retrieval augmented generation in large language models, that is connecting the LLM with a knowledge base. The knowledge generally contains some knowledge that is specific for the domains. For example, if you have a biomedical LLM, you can connect it to a knowledge base of medical knowledge. And once you ask a question to the LLM, for example, what are the available vaccines for COVID-19? First, you have a selection of the part of the knowledge base that are relevant for this question, and this context is provided to the LLM as a conditional constraint on the answer. This retrieval augmented generation could be a possible solution for allowing LLMs to produce a culturally aware translation. For example, for a game such as Black Myth Wukong, I guess you would need to provide some knowledge of Buddhism. Moreover, one limitation that LLMs have is that in the translation and localization, there might be additional goals of cultural adaptation. Political correctness for the Western audience, I think, would be a very common concern. So in conclusion, I wanted to discuss these two main issues. In the first part, what creativity is when we talk about machines. I wanted to distinguish between the different notions of creativity, and I believe that what Boden called the combinatorial creativity is probably the most relevant one for discussions about creativity with the current state of technology. And probably this level of creativity is enough to satisfy the request of industries such as the construction industry and the entertainment industry. I believe that the creatives of the future cannot afford not being proficient with the AI tools. So co-creation of artistic works with AI would be a very interesting direction to explore. And in the second part, I discuss what role will LLM play for humanities disciplines. I focus on digital humanities, I focus on cultural transmission, and I believe that video games will be a very important vehicle for cultural communication in the future. So we've seen that LLMs get very close to human translation quality on the text of Black Myth Wukong for when it comes to accuracy and fluency, but still we need to equip them with the necessary cultural specific knowledge for a better level of cultural adaptation. And this would conclude my presentation. I leave you with some references if you want to check them out. Thank you for your patience and your attention.
And for questions, discussions, remarks, opinions, disagreements? Yeah.
I think the lack of cultural components in the translation from LLM is really, really interesting. I'm wondering if there will be systematic ways to teach the LLMs about the cultural aspects, or is it going to be some fundamental aspects of what LLM cannot get? For example, the link between the language database and the real world.
So I would say that so far the technical solution that has been proposed to this kind of problem is what I call the retrieval augmented generation. So you provide a knowledge base to the model. The model has to retrieve the correct context and then use that context to formulate an answer. In our case, to formulate the correct translation. I'm a bit skeptical about it, and I have many colleagues who are skeptical about it, because I think that the needs of this kind of translation are very specific. And I'm not sure if it's feasible for every new project, every new game that you have to localize to have a specific knowledge base from which the model can pick the correct context. Also, in the application of this RAG system to commercial settings, in my knowledge, the retrieval part is quite problematic, because you can have very, very big databases with a lot of knowledge, and whether the model is able to retrieve the correct context, the correct entry in the knowledge base to translate the target sentence, that is not a trivial problem. Yeah. So in my opinion, if they're going to be used for this kind of translation, I think that the collaborative translation, again, the co-creation is still the more feasible way. Because as long as you have to create specific things, a specific knowledge basis for each project, people will just say that it's not a scalable solution enough.
So following up on what you just said about the co-creation, but I mean, nowadays in the French media, there's a lot of discussion about that, because if basically what's left for the co-creation is if the model is providing a translation that's almost good, let's say in terms of language, it's undistinguishable, but there's some cultural references, some name entities to check, then the human creator just become a checker for the LLM. Is it really creative from the human perspective? See what I mean? I mean, is the creator, the human translator, remain really creative, or is just like correcting the proposal of the LLM?
Well, I would say I think it also depends on how conservative the translator wants to be, because I think even in the examples that I showed, there are large divergences between the translation of the humans and the translation of the LLMs. In theory, one can just do some correction of what the model is producing as output, but a translator can also be more, let's say, showing his individuality in translating the text. I believe there is still a value in this. I think a good translator that can give a personal touch is still something that will produce an additional value in the age of LLMs. As I showed in one of the slides of the first part of the presentation, when you have all of the people using the same tools or the same LLMs, the linguistic diversity of the writing gets reduced. I don't know if you guys have heard about the case of Delve Into in corpus linguistics. That's a very famous case widely discussed. So delve into basically was a phrasal verb that was mostly used in African English and rarely used in other varieties of English. But probably when OpenAI developed ChatGPT, they use a massive amount of low-cost labor from Nigeria, Ghana, these countries of English-speaking Africa. And since then, all the people that are using ChatGPT to produce their text, even at the professional level or even at the academic level, they're using a lot of delve into. Everybody's using delve into all of a sudden. So he jumped directly from African English, which was less considered as an English variety, to the papers of Oxford professors. So you get this kind of effect of linguistic uniformity, and that's why I think that there is still added value in the human component.
I mean, I was not trying to say there's no added value. I'm just trying to see that the work as a translator being seen as highly creative, of course. If it becomes more like mostly checking the output of LLM, will be still seen as a highly creative job. I mean, I agree that for literary work in many contexts, you could see it this way, but there's a risk, or there's maybe not the risk. It's the fact that in the general vision of how this profession works, there might be some change.
Yeah. No, yeah, possibly. In Italian, we have this popular saying that the translator is a traitor. I don't know, in French or Chinese, we have something similar. Well, at least now they can blame the LLMs for that. Yeah.
And there's something about the so-called prompt generation.
Yeah.
If you ask the LLM to be more free and give you, for example, 3 versions, one very strict, the other free in itself, and the other actually to be creative. I don't even try this possibility.
Yeah, we haven't tried it yet because we wanted the output of the models to be constrained to allow for a better comparison. In theory, you can ask it to be creative, but the risk is that then the model goes really wild. With the LLMs, you have this problem that is called hallucination, when they produced a text that is not really linked to the original instruction. It is something that is generated from an underlying probability distribution, but is not necessarily linked to the original goal of the task. So that's why sometimes you need to link them to a knowledge base to be sure that the answer is actually an answer to the problem that you ask.
And are the people who already tried to do like many shots on this kind of task, like instead of doing the traditional RAG, like now there's some papers trying to do many shots for, and I was wondering, like, just providing 50, couple hundred example of the kind of translation you want, like.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, you have, because the context window would be a bit more limited, but yeah, you can try to improve the results by providing some examples from your data set. And I think this would also be a good strategy for a professional translator to try to instruct the language model about a specific translation strategy. Here I talk about the offensiveness. So let's imagine that here we have a translator that wants the translation to be literal because maybe he thinks that Sun Wukong is a very, how to say it, irreverent character, and it's better when the character is offensive in the original in Chinese. He wants to keep the original one as much as possible. That would be a good strategy. Just feed some few short prompts in which you instruct the model to be as conservative as possible in terms of the degree of offensiveness. Yeah.
Actually, I had some relevant question which I would like to hear your opinion. So starting from this experience, we know that how people perceive or feel the abundance of language is culturally dependent, right? I assume that if you include the annotators with the background, say from Taiwan or Hong Kong, rather than mainland China, could expect a different result to some certain degree, right? So this leads to the discussion of that LLM encodes language and fine-grained language and cultural bias, and which means I would like to know, do you have any, let's say, tech solution to this? Because if we follow this line of concept, it will be easily lead to that. Okay, then we need a different AI. Every nation, every culture has to be an AI, native AI. But you can imagine will be an endless story, because even in Taiwan, we could have we could need to have 1,000 or different kinds of AIs. So is that a good tech solution to handle the fine-grained language and culture bias? I mean, even, for example, the attendance, what I just meant, can be varied even among the Mandarin communities. Yeah.
Yeah, very good question. I think the problem of a bias in LLMs is really a big problem, especially considering that nowadays we always talk about multilingual language models. So most of the techniques that I know about deleting bias from LLM, they basically operate on an embedding space, and they try to, let's say, do some mathematical operation on the specific representation that are considered offensive, and the concept that you want to eliminate from the representation space of the model. The tricky thing when the model is multilingual is that what you delete in one language can still resurface in another language. So you're right. I think that the solution to this problem would be so specific that at that point, I think the solution with the human collaboration is still the most feasible and the most scalable one.
I also have a question that goes back to my previous one and to this one. And again, I don't have the technical vocabulary, so I'm following about the protocol that you give to the person that are evaluating in terms of more or less offensive or more or less accurate, etc. So my question is about pleasure. Can you prompt people to understand if translation is more like effective, good for stories? Like, did I like it? So not ask me if I think it's accurate, original, human, or AI, but if I liked it, whether it's sort of.
Yeah, we didn't do it in
in terms of,
Yeah, we didn't do it in this specific study because we felt that for these 3 dimensions, it was easier to explain them to the annotators. So we could have more or less a general understanding of the annotator, between the annotators, and a sort of agreement between them. Because
thinking of reception studies.
Yeah.
Regardless if a story myth is coming from AI or individual.
The dimension of the pleasure is something that was done by the studies that I cited before, the ones working on short stories. These ones, for example, they also evaluate the issue of the pleasure, whether they like them or not. They find them more original. Yeah.
And I still want to read again a story by this author, regardless of its nature, or if I have to choose subtitles, I choose the A instead of B because they are.
No, that one I don't think that they do it, but it could be cool to do that, to see if somebody particularly likes a given LLM as an author of the story. Yeah, that would be interesting.
human translators, right?
Yeah, of course, as human writers or script writers or producers, etc. Because that's one big game and tons of other that got completely forgotten.
Yeah.
So,
as I mentioned to you before, right now I'm reviewing a paper to write the plot of Bollywood movies. And basically the statement of the authors is that all the Bollywood movies are the same, so that and LLMs write the plots because it's always the same stuff. And I think to remember also in that case, there was no significant difference in appreciation between the LLM-generated stories.
The capitalist perspective, where there are winners, losers, or time is limited. So if in AI can generate tons of script scenario, but we cannot possibly fill all of them.
Yeah, indeed. that's the way that
all of them, even if we go fast.
Yeah, that's the way that we're heading, I'm afraid.
Just a technical and a more precise question about the evaluation for the first task, I think.
Yeah.
So because basically the kappa is very low, but it's basically because the LLM translation was so good that it becomes undistinguishable. So that's why agreement is low, right? I got that correct? Kappa is low because the translation, the difference between the LLM translation and the human translation is too narrow to be effectively determined. And then on the next slide, I think, no, still one more. Yeah, so this tendency to trivialize content is actually for the evaluation of the
LLMs.
So this is not yet about the level of offensiveness, right?
No, for the level of the cultural appropriateness.
Okay. So it's cultural appropriateness before talking about offensiveness.
Yeah.
Okay.
So cases like this where the LLM is missing some specific cultural reference and just translating something in a very literal way.
Yeah. Okay.
Is the evaluation blind? I mean, the annotator knows the results come from LLM or human.
They don't.
No.
Yeah, we didn't want them to have a bias or something like that.
So I mean, it's interesting because it goes back to the general issue of the first part of the talk, where about what is creativity. Because again, something that's really like more better, more creative, whatever, is because it's perfectly appropriate in a community, in a context, in a situation, or even for an individual audience, someone. And because generally speaking, it's hard to, define the creativity. So here, actually what you, in fact, in the second study, you kind of touch this very general idea that creativity is actually completely contextualized in the community, blah, 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 and not just something you can evaluate between two sentences out of context or something like that, right?
And maybe not always appreciated.
And sometimes completely missed. There could be human creators that have been ignored for centuries before recognized by their community.
If we talk about popular culture, public months ago with already known plots, tropes until a saturation point. And of course, that's thinking about the reception studies, another thorny topic in literature, cinema, or creative industry.
Yeah. No, indeed, I agree that the lack of capacity of linking to a concept and being limited to just a statistical association is a big limitation to the LLM creativity. Just about this issue, the lack of the fact of missing the context, let me link to the study that you mentioned during the introduction. The study, we published a data set called the Word Cuisine, and it's a data set of a visual question answering. So the task for the model is being presented with some pictures of dishes. We have 26 different languages, 26 different cultures, and the model has to identify the dish and has to describe the ingredients, give information about the dish, and so on. And using this dataset, we also run several studies by giving the LLM a textual context, because we wanted to see to what extent the LLM is affected by the context, to what effect it relies on visual cues, or the text that we were providing to it. So normally the LLM performed quite well in the task. It can recognize the dishes correctly across different cultures and languages, and you can give some information. But then we had a setting that we call the adversarial context. So normally you have, for example, an image showing a pizza, then the text, I'm in Italy, what dish is this? Can you give me some information about this? And the model usually answers correctly. But then imagine showing I don't know, Xiaolongbao, and you tell the model that you're not in Shanghai, but you are somewhere else. You are in Italy. Now, if you show this to a human, you can still answer correctly that we were Xiaolongbao, because this is what you're seeing in the picture. This is the context that humans have and the models do not have. But the model is generally relying on the statistical association of between words. So if you say that you're in Italy, maybe just because of the strength of the statistical association between pizza and Italy, it will tell you that this is a pizza. So I think this is also an interesting aspect, an interesting difference between language models and humans, because for us, the perception of the word, the context of the external world, is something that precedes the proficiency in the language that we use to describe the word. But for the language models, they can be visual language models, but for them it's generally the other way around. They see the text first, and then they have some kind of injection of context or knowledge afterwards. So I would say this is one of the things that is limiting them.
Any other questions? If not, I think we can give questions towards the audience, close the session. So thank you. Thank you, Emmanuele.